Unfolding the knight towards the center signals a flexible opening, potentially leading to a king's Indian attack or a ready setup, aiming for queenside pressure. Immediately establishing central space, black challenges white's tentative knight with a solid pawn. Establishing a robust pawn center and asserting control over crucial squares, white immediately stakes a claim for central space. Developing the knight to its natural square here offers flexibility, preparing to challenge the center and potentially launch a kingside attack later. Challenging black's central pawn structure creates immediate tension, opening lines for queenside expansion. Solidifying the center, black prepares to develop pieces and contest white's queenside expansion. Solidifying the center's pawn structure, NC now prepares development and potential queenside expansion, setting a classical tone. Challenging the center's grip, this pawn thrust aggressively expands black's influence and seeks to disrupt white's harmonious setup. Simplifying the center opens lines for piece development, potentially benefiting white's active knights. Centralizing the knight after the pawn exchange, this knight now eyes crucial squares and anchors black's position effectively. Solidifying the center and preparing to develop the bishop is the priority here. Developing the knight to its natural square, this move aims to solidify central control and prepare for potential pawn thrusts. Developing this bishop efficiently aims to control the crucial central squares and put pressure on black's d5 pawn, a common strategic goal. Opening the center and accepting the pawn sacrifice simplifies the position, potentially leading to dynamic piece play. Capturing the pawn clears the e-file for your rook and sets up a more active piece presence. Developing the bishop to a passive square, this move allows white to seize central space and potentially open lines for an attack. Securing the king is paramount, a prudent sidestep before further central engagement. Securing the king immediately is paramount, a prudent defensive measure before white can exploit any weaknesses. Centralizing the rook prepares a kingside pawn storm and supports the advance of the e-pawn, increasing white's initiative. Developing the queenside and preparing for a bishop fianchetto, this move anticipates a potential queenside expansion from white. Shedding a knight here simplifies, aiming to exploit the slightly less active black pieces in the ensuing structure. Opening the d-file now grants active piece play for black's rook, potentially disrupting white's central control. Targeting the pinned knight immediately creates central pressure and aims to disrupt black's pawn structure. Developing the bishop to this square solidifies the pawn chain and prepares to challenge white's central influence. Asserting pressure on the queenside, this maneuver immediately targets the dangling c5 pawn and prepares to infiltrate black's camp. The knight awkwardly retreats, conceding central influence for a potential later sortie, a passive response to white's queenside pressure. Recentralizing the bishop establishes a strong diagonal threat, preparing for potential central advances while keeping an eye on the queenside. Trading the bishop frees the b-pawn for a potential advance and challenges white's queen's placement. The queen's foray to b5 boldly probes for weaknesses, potentially setting up intricate tactical nets. Targeting the queen's escape square now disrupts white's piece activity and creates a dynamic imbalance. Maintaining queenside pressure, this repositioning readies for an eventual pawn advance while surveying potential tactical lines across the board. Reclaiming the bishop's influence on the long diagonal and preparing to contest the d-file forms the core idea behind this centralizing maneuver. Trading the bishop simplifies the position, potentially opening lines for the rook while relieving pressure on white's queenside. Finally resolving the tension on the d-file, this exchange frees black's queen for active duty and prepares for centralized piece play. Securing the open c-file now enhances pressure and prepares for potential advances down that flank. Committing the rook to the flank prematurely forfeits central influence and invites white's pieces deeper into black's territory. This maneuver repositions the queen for a potential pawn break with c5, aiming to disrupt black's pawn chain while defending the crucial c2 square. Re-establishing the rook's defensive and offensive potential on an open file allows for future pressure. Exchanging rooks clarifies the position, preparing for a potential endgame by removing attacking pieces. Black solidifies their queenside pawn structure and opens a diagonal for their bishop. Pioneering the open c-file now, this query about Black's queen mobility is relentless. Trading queens here releases the pressure and initiates an endgame where piece activity will be paramount. Capturing the pawn establishes a passed pawn and dominates the 7th rank, forcing concessions from Black's remaining pieces. Solidifying the pawn structure prevents White from exploiting weaknesses on the king side. Prioritizing king safety, White tucks the monarch away from the d-file's influence, aiming for a more stable endgame structure. Centralizing the rook on the 7th rank offers a dynamic re-engagement with White's exposed king. Penetrating the king's sanctuary, this rook sacrifice creates immediate threats and forces a defensive reaction, opening up the center. A tactical retreat under duress, conceding a vital open file to the adversary's rook. Asserting influence over the central files, this repositioning aims to pressure Black's pawn structure while preparing to activate the rook further. Opening the king side to potentially activate the rook, but this could expose weaknesses later. Realigning knights to contest crucial central squares and prepare for an endgame initiative. This pawn advances, aiming to gain kingside space and potentially create an outpost, but it weakens the adjacent squares and risks overextension. Opening the kingside pawn structure might invite greater exposure for your monarch. This pawn push aims to seize space and create a queenside outpost for the knight. Challenging Black's pawn shield, this move aims to disrupt coordination and exploit the open file. Securing the rook's activity on the open file, this move prepares to challenge White's centralized rook and bolster Black's kingside defense. Reinforcing the kingside and preparing for a knight repositioning offers robust defense against Black's advancing pawns. Carving open a path for the knight to infiltrate, but this pawn push weakens the kingside structure considerably. Repositioning the knight to a more active central square promises greater influence on the queen side. Provoking a pawn break on the king side, this move aims to create dynamism in an otherwise static position. Repositioning the knight allows it to control key central squares and prepare for an advance on the king side. Unleashing the pawn creates immediate dynamic potential on the king side, challenging White's knight and opening new avenues for counterplay. Opening the kingside pawns invites immediate skirmishes and could expose your monarch to unwelcome attention. Opening the g-file after the pawn push will grant significant attacking chances. Opening the g-file offers a direct path to Black's kingside, creating immediate pressure and potential weaknesses. Initiating a pawn storm on the queen side introduces significant complexity. Opens the door for the queen to invade the king side. The king steps onto the board, seeking an active role in the unfolding endgame battles. Unleashing a central pawn push after the rook maneuver creates immediate pressure and opens avenues for further advancement. Securing the king is paramount, as the rook's menacing presence demands constant vigilance. Bringing the king into the heart of the action signals a readiness to engage in the ensuing pawn skirmishes and potentially centralize your forces. Reinforces the rook on the 7th rank, challenging White's control and preparing for potential pawn advances. Solidifying the kingside presence, this pawn advance aims to prevent Black's rook from penetrating further down the 7th rank. Initiating a perilous journey, Black's monarch ventures into the fray, a bold decision with potentially significant king exposure. Centering the king grants it a crucial central outpost for future maneuvers. Reactivating the knight via b8 opens up possibilities for queenside counterplay and may pressure White's d4 pawn. Threatening the king's escape route and preparing to consolidate against Black's passed pawn. Unleashing the knight toward the center signals an intent to contest the d-file and disrupt White's consolidated position. Reactivating the knight's centralizing potential offers fresh attacking avenues. Re-establishing the knight on a more active central square allows for future control of d4. Sacrificing the rook for initiative, and king hunt is a bold, aggressive gamble in this tense endgame. This king's maneuver is a risky retreat, leaving the monarch exposed in the center of the board. Fortifying the knight outpost with a tempo gain on the rook's advanced position solidifies central control and initiates an attack. Diverting the rook from defense allows the knight to infiltrate and control key squares. Forcing the king into a corner with a royal fork. Shifting the king toward the queen side might be a defensive measure, but it leaves the remaining pawns somewhat exposed. Recapturing the pawn opens up the knight's influence and prepares to contest the important central files. This move allows white's knight to reach a dominant central outpost, potentially dictating the flow of the endgame. Activating the rook on the open file presents a tactical threat against black's vulnerable king. Navigating the knight to the queen side aims to disrupt white's pieces and potentially create mating threats. Eliminating that knight suddenly simplifies the board, opening up your rook's path and potentially creating passed pawns. Opening the file now grants black active counterplay against white's isolated queenside pawns. Capturing the pawn solidifies white's material advantage and opens lines for the rook to become more active. Reclaiming the c-file opens avenues for counterplay against the exposed white king. Re-establishing pressure on the queenside rook file aims to restrict black's knight mobility. Consolidating the rook to the d-file offers improved control of open lines and prepares for potential pawn breakthroughs. Capturing that pawn immediately simplifies the position, creating an open file for your rook and initiating the endgame sequence. Bringing the rook into play on the already contested king file significantly increases pressure on white's king. The rook's retreat opens a vital diagonal, aiming to exploit the opponent's exposed king. Seizing the open file now, black seeks to untangle their rook and create counterplay against white's exposed king. The king ventures out, aiming to support the rook and disrupt black's encroaching pawns.